Awesome. Our recording is on, everybody. Welcome into our fitness forum. We are so happy that you're here. I am Kristy with the TC Fit team. This is Dr. Jon Frikken. He is joining us today.
Hello.
He is our expert on our strength training. He has a lot to share with you, great information. So first off, welcome and thank you. Secondly, if you're joining late, we are recording this just for your own safety, just so you know that it is being recorded. Otherwise, yeah, I'm the wellness coordinator with TC Fit. Contracted into General Mills. That's where we are now. Dr. Jon Frikken works with Motion, both in St. Paul and Minnetonka. Do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I also have a background. I was a personal trainer. I'm a CrossFit level 1 trainer as well. Started exercising and working out when I was in my junior high years when I had to look at men's fitness to get tips on how to squat and things like that. So I'm happy to be here to, pass along some of the things that I've learned along the way.
For sure. Even just preparing for this, he has so much information and knowledge to share. So we can't wait to share that with you guys. To start, I guess we welcome your questions, your comments in the chat box. We have Matt watching over that for us. So he will relay those messages to us as best he can as we go. So feel free, put your questions, your comments, concerns there. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. We got a lot to cover, so we'll waste no more time. Go ahead, Jon.
All right. So just to start off with, I just want to look at what would be a basic good squat. So things that I'm looking at for a squat is that we have a braced neutral spine, that we're actually have your feet about shoulder width apart. This can vary a little bit, which we'll go over a bit more later on. As you squat down, your hips will break first, and then you'll sit down like you have a little chair underneath right behind your heels. And then as you're doing that, your knees are staying in line with your feet, not caving in, not going way excessively far out either. Things that can happen with this, so what we'll start off with is just talking about having a braced neutral spine. Kind of a really easy way to look at this is to use a PVC pipe. When you use this PVC pipe, you're basically think about that PVC pipe being your braced neutral spine. You're just using it as a cue. So we're going to have it touching at the back of the head, shoulders, and right above the butt. And then as you do this, you're going to squat down, keeping that PVC pipe in place where it's touching all three of those locations. If you feel it where or let's say you don't feel it in one of those three locations, then probably something's happening, either arching too much, rounding too much, something like that. So it can be a nice, easy cue for people to just feel, what does like a straight or neutral-ish spine kind of feel like? So that's one that I'll default to just make a kind of a quick, easy check to say, like, well, what does my squat like kind of feel like? Is it staying neutral? Is it not? From there, everybody doesn't have a PVC pipe around, so then I'll use a little trick that I learned actually through a physical therapist called Julie Weeb, where we actually key into what our breath is doing while we're actually trying to find that neutral spine. And we'll find the neutral spine based on where our breath is going. So when we talk about intra-abdominal pressure, the pressure that's in this system here, we're talking about how the muscles coordinate in kind of the deep core system. We call this like the diaphragm, pelvic floor, transversus abdominis, and multifidus. They all work together to make this deep core system. And how that works is if we try to use our diaphragm, you've probably heard somebody say like use a diaphragmatic breath. Think about the diaphragm as an umbrella. So as you breathe in, it expands out to the sides. As you breathe out, it closes around the umbrella or the handle of that umbrella. And what you'll find is when you try to do that kind of a breath, you might find that either your breath goes into three locations. If you're arched back and try to do that, you might feel that it'll actually kind of expand up into the chest. If you're rounded forward and try to do that same breath, you might feel that it actually comes really more out to the front. But when you find that spot kind of in the middle, you'll find that it actually wants to go more out towards the sides. And then in that way, you're going to get more of a 360-degree expansion. We want to be able to expand 360 degrees to know that we're breathing in from a neutral spine position. All right, so once you kind of find that neutral position, the next thing that I like to look at is what are some faults that you might do as you're squatting. So one of them might be that you actually do have a neutral spine, but it's what we call an immature squat. So as you go to squat, you're bending over, but then your chest starts to lean further and further forward. Ideally, I'd like the chest to stay a little bit more upright as you go to squat down. Another one that might happen is that as you go down, you'll find that actually the butt will start to kind of round over. It's actually a posterior tilt of the pelvis. And in this way, we call it butt wink is kind of a term that can be used. Another thing that might happen would be just everything starts kind of caving in, not really keeping a neutral spine at all, just everything's kind of rounded. And this might be like if you're holding a dumbbell and maybe you're using too much, it's just beyond maybe what your capacity is at the time. It could be that, you need to work on back strength, different things like that. Yeah. But those would be things I'd be looking for as far as like faults with not keeping a neutral spine. Yeah. Going back to hip mobility. So like I said, depending on how you squat, you might want a little bit wider of a squat. You might want a little bit narrower of a squat. I generally give people like a shoulder width as a general cue for this is roughly where we want to start. But a way to check that out would be if you're lying on your back and you pull your knee up to your chest and kind of going in and out, working in different spots and seeing, well, where does my knee seem to want to go up the best? And then if you take that position, let's say it's out like this, then that would kind of correlate to that's how far away you'd want your feet to be when you're actually doing the squat. It can also be just a check to see, like, can you bring your knees up? How far can you bring your knees up? Because that can also relate to, well, if you can only bring it up this far, maybe this is where we want to go, just into a little partial squat as we're squatting.
Right. And I think a big key with that too is everyone's going to look a little bit different. There's no one exact perfect squat form, especially with your feet, your knees, things like that. So just keep that in mind. You're not going to look exactly the same as a person next to you, and that's okay.
Hey, Jon and Kristy,
can I ask a quick question? Kind of come into play here too is if you start going out too wide, you might not have that mobility, and that's what's actually dragging your knees in a little bit. And if you go too narrow, you might not have the ankle mobility where here at the ankles, it has to move so that your knees can go out even to squat in that position. So there's little different nuances and variability that can happen from person to person.
Right.
All right. So the next thing that I talked about, I said, I want your hips to start going back first. So a little cue that I give off, and I did actually bring it up in the beginning, is to just pretend like you have a little chair or something right behind your heels. This might be a little bit low, but just for an example, it's kind of a target. So as you break at the hips just a little bit, then you want to sit down and then come on back up. One thing that you'll see is people are like, oh, well, my hips are supposed to go back. So then they'll go back into that immature squat that I talked about. But at some point, we actually need to go down. That's one actually my main differentiators between like a squat and a deadlift. Mm-hmm. A squat, I want my hips to go down. With a deadlift, I want my hips to go back and then down. Mm-hmm. But just a little bit of a difference between the two movements.
Yep. Hey, Jon, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Jon, this is Matt. Can you just tell the group, why do we even want to squat, number one? And then number two, just kind of the different variations that you see in a gym, and then maybe where people want to start to make sure their mechanics and make sure that they're remaining injury free.
Sure. Good question. Go for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, squatting in and of itself is kind of one of those basic things that we need to be able to do just to go ahead and stand up out of a chair. That's using basically the same muscles. It's really a good way to develop some lower body strength. If you're using a load where you're, holding a dumbbell up here, or if you're back squatting, front squatting, overhead squatting, all kinds of different numbers, then you're actually bringing in some more upper body strength as well. But really making sure that you have just generally lower body strength to actually just do things like stand up out of chairs. And that maybe not as important as you're 20 years old, but as we get older and older and older, we're all aging people. We're all going to be older adults one of these days. So we want to set ourselves up to be, strong and resilient even later in the life as well.
Another thing that I'll just add, I guess, as I'm thinking about this question, when you're young and you're a toddler, you see your toddlers all the time pick up things like this. As you grow older, you see people just start to bend so far forward, and that's where your form is going to be so important. So I guess even squatting can aid in your low back strength, your core strength, everything like that. So I guess that's my biggest pointer, is that It builds lower body strength, obviously, but your core, your low back, balance, it all adds up.
And there's even, studies too that say, like, if you back squat a certain percentage of your body weight, granted it's pretty high, it really brings down your risk of injury too. So the stronger that we are, the more we're able to go out and do fun things that we want to do and still participate and have less chance for injury. Right. And to some extent that makes sense, right? Because if the muscles are stronger, they're more capable, they're more able to handle those loads. If we're going to do something like a quick turn, or if we're playing ultimate frisbee and we have to catch and turn, change directions, or fill in the blank there.
Right. To brace a fall, if you're older adults, for sure.
And then if we are loading, and you're new to squatting and making sure you're doing things correctly to protect your joints, is there one better way to start loading, guys, or can I just start back squatting or overhead squatting right away?
Yeah, and really I would boil that down to who you are, because there's a lot of different nuances that we can talk about as far as squatting goes. Do you let your knees go forward? Don't you? Do you bend over further? Don't you? Really starting at that spot where you feel like you can complete the squat in a good, safe manner. That means avoiding some of these compensations that we're talking about. Starting there and then trying to add in as you get more, get a bit more strength and a bit more maybe mobility, so you can work into different positions that way. And basically that's the guidance. I'll just say start where you are, improve incrementally, just little jumps. Whether you go by the 1% a day, research would say like 10% a week. Just giving you that as a reference, that it's small things that actually add up over time. It's the old tortoise and the hare type of analogy. If we run out the gate and try to get everything right away, we actually probably will run into those barriers where we might do something where we're doing something that maybe the knee can't handle, the tissue is just not ready for. So just little bumps at a time. If you're starting from a spot where you haven't lifted before, do just a little bit. See how you feel. Kind of come back to it a couple of days later after your body's recovered, and try again from there.
For sure. Okay, and I would add
just a couple comments but Kristy, I'll let you add here if you want. First, I have a few comments from the chat box I want to share.
Yeah, for sure. Just from a personal trainer's aspect, I always say start low and go slow. So you might start with body weight squats if you're a beginner, and that's great. Maybe you add 1 dumbbell, maybe you add 2 dumbbells. Barbells are going to be kind of a whole nother level, I would say, versus a dumbbell. I always start my clients off with dumbbells before I get them into either a front squat, a back squat, things like that. So start low, go slow, use what you're comfortable with. And if you have questions, you always have resources to come to. So go ahead, Matt.
So then Emily, just plug in, Emily just in the chat box commented, plugging squatting. When I focus on squats and lower body, my workouts, I notice many more of my daily activities are easier and more pain-free. There you go. There's a nice plug, kind of alluding to what Jon was saying. And then Victoria has a question here as well. She said, when I squat, my hip flexors tend to hurt and get sore. Am I doing something wrong, or are they just too tight and need to be stretched?
I'm going to pass that to Jon. He's the doctor here. So when we talk about our hip flexors when it comes to squatting, that can be a bit of a more complicated question, because sometimes it's not actually the hip flexors. Sometimes it's just how the hip joint itself feels. So making sure that, you know, we have that ability to do maybe that hip mobility screen, and then going back and performing the actual squat to that level. So if we're doing that knee to chest and we're only getting it to about here, well then, you know, if you're trying to really go further and further, then you might be, you know, working the hip joint to a point that your hip joint isn't maybe ready for. And again, that can actually be influenced too by our braced neutral spine or not. It's like if you do too much of an arch, then actually that can really make it harder for the hip joint, because you're really bringing your pelvis into an anterior rotated position. And when the socket and the ball come into play, it's going to start actually running into it maybe a little bit earlier. Whereas if you have a neutral spine, then it has a little bit more room to move.
Okay, so what you're saying is it could be more the joint than the actual hip flexor.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we were chatting about this when we were preparing. Is everybody is so different, and there are things that's going to work for some people and that aren't going to work for the others. So always keep that in mind too.
Yeah, if I were to say anything, I would say try to see if you can squat from that braced neutral spine position. And if that improves things, that might give you a key that maybe you don't have to worry about your hip flexor quite as much. Maybe think about just the form that you're using at the same time. But that can also key into this if it's more narrow or a little bit further out. If the knee is a little bit further out, sometimes that can make a little bit more room for the hip. Things can just feel a little bit better as you descend down into that squat.
Sure.
That's great.
Yeah, we're gonna go on to deadlifts. I heard another ping in the chat box.
Yeah,
but we only got.
Okay, this is from Michelle. She asked about what about weight in the feet? Where should the pressure be connected with the foot onto the floor?
Yep. Do we have that in our notes too? Michelle, you're reading our mind. I love it. Jon, take it away.
Yeah, so when we look at the weight in your feet, there's some different cues that can get a bit confusing. A lot of times people say, put the weight in your heels, put the weight in your heels. But what we really want is a distribution behind the big toe, behind the little toe, and the heel. Really, that comes to being like kind of mid-foot. So for instance, if we had a barbell and we're doing something like a front squat, we would want that barbell to track right in line with our mid-foot as we go. Why you typically hear people say, well, we want the weight in our heels, that's because when people squat, they're coming up like this. So yes, in that case, I want it more in the heels, but not necessarily just in the heels. I want that to be like a distributed pressure amongst both feet, amongst those 3 locations. I find that a lot easier to think about just like weight through the midfoot versus trying to think about 6 different points in my feet.
Sure.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah. Want to cover deadlifts for in the next 5 minutes or so?
Sure.
What do you think?
Yeah. I will say, I know Matt mentioned quickly about like different variations of squatting. One of the ways that I like to do is just like with a goblet squat, you can just hold a weight and sit down. I would probably make sure that you can do an air squat before you start adding weight, but that would be one variation. I did just mention, front squat. You can do a squat with a bar on your shoulders, on the back on your shoulders. There's even different ones where you're doing like an overhead squat. There's a lot of different variations out there. So some of that will be, either working with somebody to figure out what variation it works for you, or, I would say start lighter before you try something brand new. I mean, just because, let's say you could back squat 200 pounds, does not mean you could even front squat 90 pounds.
Right.
So I always tell people to start low.
Go slow, baby.
There you go.
Comes full circle.
All
Good.
Right. So with the deadlift, I'll again use that PVC pipe to get that braced neutral spine, just to get a little cue. But here, I always tell people, think like you're trying to drive your butt back towards the wall behind you. I think part of where people get confused is they think, oh, I'm supposed to bring my chest down. I like to redirect so that people are thinking like butt back, especially for the initial part of that deadlift. So as opposed to the squat, I want the butt to go down. Here, I want the butt to go back, reaching for the back wall. Yeah. Now, if you have that weight in your hands, or if you have a barbell, either way, the way I want to like kind of set up for this. So if you have the weight on the floor, let's go up.
Other way.
Yeah, let's go vertical. So I want to actually start with this like right between your feet, because the closer the weight is to your base support, the easier it's going to be. Think about holding something out here. It's way harder than if you hold it here. So she's going to push her butt back until she gets her hands to about her knees. And then from here, everything's going to go down. So here we would start the deadlift by, go ahead and go down to the dumbbell.
Sure.
By pushing our feet into the floor until you get to the knees. So push it, there we go. And then hips go forward. Butt goes back to the knees. Now everything goes down. To the knees, push through the floor, then hips forward, butt back, and down. Where you can get caught up a little bit here is, so if you set up, she is a good position because she has, go ahead, can you stay in that for a second?
Yeah.
Thanks.
We're going to burn.
Yeah. So her shoulders are above her hips are above her knees. So by doing that, she's setting herself up in a good position. What can happen sometimes is people's butts will be really high compared to the shoulders. Now, this is a position that they can probably do. It's not necessarily dangerous. However, it does create a bit more stress or more work for the lower back and the glutes. So bringing the butt down will actually let your quads work a little bit more.
Oh, they're working.
and it's kind of a misnomer to say like deadlift is a glute and hamstring exercise. Actually, EMG studies would say that actually the quad is actually the muscle that's working more than anything. So don't forget to use the little quad, but I also would caution that you're not letting your knees shoot way forward, so it just looks like you're doing a deadlift, or sorry, a squat with the weight here.
Yep.
But and Jon, the deadlift looks, Kristy's making it look very simple. I think I see a lot of people deadlifting with poor form, and I do think if people wanted to, they should pop down and see Kristy and talk about their form with the deadlifts. Those are our General Mills employees, just to make sure they're doing things correctly, because I do see injuries from deadlifting, and maybe people are doing too much load too soon, like you guys said, not going low and slow. But I do think it's a looks like it's very simple. Kristy's making it look very easy with her fine body mechanics there.
Yeah.
And I just want to plug, Kendall put up in the chat box just Kristy and Dr. Jon Frikken's emails if you have other questions. We're trying to figure out a way too to maybe bring Jon back on site to do a little personal one-on-one time just to see and look at your mechanics. Certainly Kristy can help with that as well, but I wanted to put that in there before we wind down.
Yeah, just to make sure I got the date right, that is a very good segue into our closing because we only have a couple minutes left. On August 1st, Dr. Jon's going to be back at General Mills. So if you're a General Mills employee, we're going to book out 20-minute time slots. You can meet one-on-one with Jon, ask him your squat, your deadlift questions, or any other strength training questions. 25 minutes is super short to talk mechanics and errors and form correction. So if you have specific questions, I think Tove asked about the hip flexor. It's a great question. Maybe you can work a little bit better one-on-one with Dr. Jon. He's going to be here August 1st. If you're interested in coming in for a 20-minute kind of session with him, put your General Mills email address in the chat. I'm going to pull all those emails. There's only 6 people that can do it. So if you want it, get in on it now. Otherwise, if you're a non-General Mills employee, that's okay too. You can always reach out to me. My general email address will work just fine. I can work with you one-on-one as well. So that's basically all we have. Thank you all for joining us.
One last thing, guys. What is Jon a doctor of?
A doctor of physical therapy.
Strength.
Okay, all right. All right, so Dr. Jon's a doctor of physical therapy, just to let people know from some background there.
He is, yes, he's one of the best.
Right.
But yeah, thank you guys for joining us for our fitness forum. We hope to have more of these coming up soon. Otherwise, thank you, Dr. Jon, for joining us as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For sure. It was great. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. I learn every day from experts and people that aren't me. So it's great. We will see you next time. Thank you for joining. That's all we got.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for joining.